The desert wind carried the sound of sobbing across the barren landscape of southern Arizona, where broken dreams went to die under the merciless sun. Marcus Stone had heard plenty of crying in his 43 years, cattle in distress, coyotes mourning their dead, and the occasional drunk cowhand nursing regrets over whiskey. But this sound was different. This was the kind of desperate weeping that came from a soul stripped bare, echoing from the abandoned church that sat like a monument to forgotten faith on the edge of his property. What Marcus found inside that crumbling sanctuary would shatter every cynical belief he'd built around his heart like armor. The woman kneeling at the altar wasn't just praying, she was pleading with a God that Marcus was certain had stopped listening to people like them long ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Stone's boots hit the wooden floor of Bailey's saloon with the same heavy rhythm they'd maintained for the past 8 years, every Tuesday night at exactly 9 o'clock. The patrons of Copper Ridge's only drinking establishment had learned to recognize that sound, the methodical pace of a man who drank not for pleasure, but for the temporary numbness that alcohol provided against memories too sharp to bear sober. "Usual, Marcus?" called out Jimmy Bailey from behind the bar, already reaching for the bottle of Kentucky bourbon that had become as much a part of Marcus's routine as checking fence lines or feeding cattle. Marcus nodded without speaking, settling onto the worn leather bar stool that had molded itself to his frame over years of identical evenings. The saloon buzzed with the typical Tuesday crowd, ranch hands celebrating payday, traveling salesmen seeking company, and local businessmen conducting deals over poker games that would determine who prospered and who failed in the unforgiving economy of small-town Arizona. None of them paid particular attention to Marcus Stone anymore. In the 8 years since he'd returned from his disastrous stint as sheriff of neighboring Millbrook County, he'd perfected the art of being invisible while occupying space. People knew his story, whispered about it in hushed tones when they thought he couldn't hear, but they'd learned to leave him alone with his demons. The Stone Ranch sprawled across 12,000 acres of some of the harshest terrain in Arizona, land that had been in Marcus's family for 4 generations. His great-grandfather, Benjamin Stone, had claimed the territory back in 1887, building an empire through sheer determination and an unwavering belief that hard work and moral character could overcome any obstacle. That faith had been passed down through 3 generations of Stone men, each adding to the family's reputation for integrity and community leadership. Marcus had inherited all of it: the land, the cattle, the family name, and the crushing weight of expectations that came with being the latest in a line of respected men. What he'd lost along the way was any belief that integrity mattered in a world designed to reward corruption and punish those foolish enough to believe in justice. The bourbon burned his throat as he downed the first shot, feeling the familiar warmth spread through his chest. Around him, conversations flowed about cattle prices, weather predictions, and local gossip, but Marcus heard none of it. His mind was trapped in a continuous loop of regret, replaying the events that had transformed him from a man of faith and purpose into the hollow shell that now occupied his grandfather's favorite barstool. 8 years ago, Marcus Stone had been sheriff of Millbrook County, a position he'd accepted reluctantly after the previous sheriff died of a heart attack. The county commissioners had begged him to take the job, arguing that his family's reputation and his own military background made him the ideal candidate to clean up a department plagued by corruption and incompetence. Marcus had believed them. More importantly, he'd believed in the possibility of making a difference, of using his position to protect the innocent and punish those who preyed on the vulnerable. That faith had lasted exactly 18 months, ending on a sweltering August night when he discovered just how naive his belief in justice really was. Deputy Sheriff Carol Manning had been Marcus's closest friend on the force, a dedicated officer who shared his commitment to honest law enforcement. She'd been investigating a human trafficking ring that operated along the border, following leads that suggested several prominent citizens were involved in the operation. Carol had confided in Marcus about her investigation, sharing evidence that implicated a judge, 2 county commissioners, and the mayor of Millbrook in the systematic exploitation of undocumented women. The evidence was overwhelming financial. Records, photographs, witness testimonies from women brave enough to come forward, despite the obvious dangers. Marcus had encouraged Carol to continue her investigation, promising to provide whatever support she needed to bring the perpetrators to justice. They'd planned to present their case to the state attorney general, bypassing local authorities, who might be compromised. Carol Manning never got the chance to present that evidence. Her body was found in her patrol car at the bottom of Canyon Creek, the victim of what the accident investigation team ruled a single vehicle crash caused by driver fatigue. The car had somehow veered off a road Carol had driven hundreds of times, plunging 30 feet into a rocky ravine where the wreckage caught fire, destroying most of the physical evidence along with Carol's life. Marcus had known immediately that Carol's death was murder, but knowing and proving were 2 entirely different things. The investigation into the accident was handled by the same department that Carol had been investigating, overseen by officials who had every reason to ensure that her discoveries died with her. Within a week, all of Carol's files related to the trafficking investigation had mysteriously disappeared from the sheriff's department, and Marcus found himself facing a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could pursue the investigation on his own, risking his career and possibly his life in a fight against enemies who'd already demonstrated their willingness to kill. Or he could accept the official story, keep his position, and live with the knowledge that Carol's murderers would never face justice. Marcus had chosen a third option. He'd resigned from the sheriff's department and retreated to his family ranch, carrying with him the bitter certainty that honor and integrity were luxuries that honest men couldn't afford in a world controlled by those willing to do anything to protect their interests. The resignation had shocked the community. Marcus Stone, descendant of 4 generations of respected leaders, had simply walked away from his responsibility to serve and protect. The whispered speculation about his reasons had eventually faded into acceptance that even the Stone family's legendary integrity had its limits. Only Marcus knew the truth, that he hadn't quit because he was weak, but because he'd finally understood that the system he'd believed in was fundamentally corrupt. Fighting it would only result in more good people getting killed while the guilty remained untouchable. The bourbon continued flowing as Marcus lost himself in memories of the aftermath. The first year after his resignation had been the worst, filled with sleepless nights and a rage that threatened to consume what remained of his sanity. He'd considered leaving Arizona entirely, selling the ranch and starting over somewhere his family name meant nothing and his failure wouldn't follow him. But the land held him like a chain. 4 generations of Stone men were buried in the family cemetery on the eastern ridge, and Marcus couldn't bring himself to abandon their legacy completely. Instead, he'd settled into a routine of isolation and self-medication, maintaining the ranch's operations while systematically destroying his connections to the community his family had served for over a century. The Stone Ranch still prospered. Under Marcus's management, his business sense and work ethic hadn't been affected by his loss of faith. But the man who'd once opened his doors to neighbors in need and donated generously to community causes had disappeared, replaced by someone who fulfilled his obligations without joy or hope. "You're quieter than usual tonight," Jimmy Bailey observed, refilling Marcus's glass without being asked. The bartender had known Marcus since childhood and was one of the few people willing to engage him in conversation. "Nothing new to say," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the flat tone that had become his default mode of communication. "Same problems, same disappointments, same people pretending the world makes sense." Jimmy nodded sympathetically, understanding that Marcus's bitterness ran deeper than simple misanthropy. Heard old Father Martinez is finally retiring from St. Joseph's. Been there 43 years, can you believe that? Marcus grunted acknowledgement without interest. Father Martinez had been the priest at St. Joseph's Catholic Church since before Marcus was born. A gentle man who'd baptized, confirmed, married, and buried 3 generations of Copper Ridge residents. His retirement would mark the end of an era, but Marcus felt no connection to the faith that had once provided comfort and guidance. Wonder who they'll send to replace him, Jimmy continued, polishing glasses while he talked. Hopefully someone who understands small-town life. These young priests they're ordaining these days, they don't seem to grasp what it takes to minister to working people. The conversation drifted to other topics: weather, politics, the ongoing drought that threatened to make this year's cattle season particularly challenging. Marcus participated minimally, offering occasional nods or single-word responses while his mind wandered through the landscape of regret that had become his permanent residence. By 10:30, the saloon had begun emptying as working men headed home to wives and families. Marcus remained at the bar, nursing his 4th bourbon and contemplating whether to make it a 5th. The alcohol had achieved its intended effect, blunting the sharp edges of memory and creating a temporary buffer between his consciousness and the weight of his disillusionment. "You planning to sleep here tonight?" Jimmy asked with gentle humor, beginning his closing routine of wiping down tables and collecting empty glasses. Marcus drained his glass and stood, leaving exact change on the bar as he'd done every Tuesday. "For 8 years. Thanks, Jimmy. See you next week." The walk from Bailey's saloon to the Stone Ranch covered 3 miles of desert, road illuminated only by starlight and the occasional security light from neighboring properties. Marcus had made this journey hundreds of times, usually in a state of controlled intoxication that made the solitude bearable without rendering him completely incapacitated. Tonight felt different, though he couldn't identify why. The desert air carried an unusual quality, as if something significant was about to happen. Marcus dismissed the feeling as alcohol-induced paranoia. 8 years of disappointment had taught him that anticipating change only led to greater disillusionment. When reality failed to meet expectations, the Stone Ranch house sat at the end of a quarter-mile driveway lined with cottonwood trees that Marcus's grandmother had planted in the 1940s. The 2-story structure had been built by his grandfather in 1923, designed in the Spanish colonial revival style that reflected the region's cultural heritage. It was a beautiful home, filled with handcrafted furniture and family heirlooms that spoke of prosperity and permanence. Marcus rarely spent time in the main house anymore, preferring the smaller foreman's cabin where his grandfather had lived. During the early years of the ranch's operation, the cabin felt more appropriate for a man who'd abandoned any pretense of continuing his family's legacy of community leadership. As he approached the fork in the driveway that led to either the main house or the foreman's cabin, Marcus noticed something that stopped him in his tracks. Light was visible through the windows of the old chapel that sat on the eastern edge of his property. About half a mile from the main house, the chapel hadn't been used in over 15 years, not since Marcus's grandmother had passed away and taken with her the last vestige of religious observance on the Stone Ranch, built by his great-grandfather as a place for family worship and community gatherings. The small stone structure had gradually fallen into disrepair as successive generations of stone men became too busy with ranch operations to maintain their spiritual practices. Marcus stared at the unexpected illumination, his bourbon clouded, mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The chapel had no electricity. The power lines had been disconnected years ago when the roof started leaking, and Marcus decided the building wasn't worth maintaining. Yet unmistakably, warm light glowed from within the abandoned structure. His first thought was trespassers, possibly transients seeking shelter or teenagers using the isolated building for parties. Marcus felt a surge of anger at the violation of his property, combined with bitter amusement that someone would choose an abandoned chapel for illicit activities. The irony seemed perfectly suited to his current worldview. Marcus changed direction, walking toward the chapel with the determined stride of a man prepared to confront whoever had invaded his privacy. The desert night was cool and clear, with a three-quarter moon providing enough ambient light to navigate the familiar terrain without difficulty. As he drew closer to the chapel, Marcus realized that the light inside wasn't electric. It had the warm, flickering quality of candles or oil lamps. The discovery only increased his irritation. Whoever was trespassing had not only violated his property, but was creating a fire hazard in a building filled with dry wood and decades of accumulated debris. The chapel's heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar, allowing a narrow beam of golden light to spill onto the ground outside. Marcus approached cautiously, his anger tempered by curiosity about what he might find inside. What he heard as he reached the door stopped him completely. Someone was praying inside the chapel, and the sound of that prayer carried a depth of desperation that cut through Marcus's alcoholic haze like a blade. It wasn't the rote recitation of memorized words, but the raw, anguished pleading of someone whose soul was being torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. Marcus stood frozen outside the door, listening to a woman's voice rise and fall, in a rhythm of supplication that he recognized from his own childhood, when prayer had been as natural as breathing and faith had provided answers to life's most difficult questions. The woman was asking for forgiveness, for strength, for a chance at redemption that she clearly believed was beyond her reach. Her words were punctuated by sobs that spoke of grief so profound that Marcus felt his own long-buried emotions stirring in response. Despite his cynicism about faith and divine intervention, Marcus found himself reluctant to interrupt the woman's prayer. There was something sacred about the raw honesty of her communication with whatever power she believed might be listening, something that reminded him of his own desperate prayers during the darkest days after Carol Manning's murder. But trespassing was still trespassing, regardless of the spiritual nature of the intrusion. Marcus pushed open the chapel door and stepped inside, prepared to demand an explanation for the woman's presence on his property. What he saw in the flickering candlelight would haunt him for the rest of his life, challenging every assumption he'd made about redemption, forgiveness, and the possibility that grace might still exist in a fallen world. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The woman kneeling at the makeshift altar didn't hear Marcus enter the chapel. Her entire being was focused on the conversation she was having with a God she wasn't certain would listen to someone like her. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched a worn Bible that looked like it had survived decades of desperate handling, its pages soft with age and marked with countless underlines and notes written in fading ink. Marcus stood in the doorway, taking in the scene before him with a mixture of anger and unwelcome fascination. The woman appeared to be in her early 30s, with long auburn hair that caught the candlelight and reflected it in shades of copper and gold. She wore a simple blue dress that had seen better days, and her bare feet were dirty from walking across the desert terrain that surrounded his property. What struck Marcus most forcefully wasn't her appearance, but the intensity of her prayer. This wasn't someone going through religious motions or seeking comfort through familiar rituals. This was a soul in genuine agony, pleading for something that seemed impossibly beyond her reach. God, I know I don't deserve to ask for anything, the woman whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. I know what I've done, what I've been. But if there's any mercy left in this world, if there's any chance for someone like me to start over, please show me how. Marcus felt an uncomfortable stirring in his chest, a recognition of the same desperate hope he'd once felt during his own darkest moments. The woman's prayer contained the same raw honesty that had characterized his own appeals to heaven in the weeks after Carol Manning's death. when he'd still believed that justice might prevail if he asked for divine intervention, with sufficient sincerity. "Please," the woman continued, "I can't keep living like this. I can't keep being what I've become. Help me find a way to be someone different, someone worthy of the life you gave me." Marcus cleared his throat loudly, causing the woman to gasp, and spin around to face him. In the candlelight, he could see that she was beautiful in a fragile, haunted way that spoke of experiences no one should have to endure. Her eyes were large and dark, filled with a combination of terror and resignation. That suggested she was accustomed to expecting the worst from every encounter with strangers. "This is private property," Marcus said, his voice harsher than he'd intended. The alcohol and his natural defensiveness combined to make him sound more threatening than he felt. "You're trespassing." The woman scrambled to her feet, clutching the Bible to her chest like a shield. "I'm sorry," she stammered, backing toward the wall of the chapel. "I didn't think anyone would mind." "The building looked abandoned." "It is abandoned," Marcus replied. "That doesn't make it public property." He studied her face more carefully, noting the hollow cheeks and dark circles under her eyes that suggested she hadn't been eating or sleeping regularly. Despite his irritation at the intrusion, he couldn't ignore the obvious signs that this woman was in serious trouble. "I'll leave right away," the woman said, moving toward the door with the quick, nervous movements of someone who'd learned to flee from confrontation. "I'm sorry for bothering you." Something in her immediate willingness to submit and apologize triggered a memory in Marcus's mind. He'd seen that same response pattern in the women Carol Manning had interviewed during her trafficking investigation. The automatic assumption that any interaction with a man would result in punishment or violence. "Wait," Marcus said, his tone softening slightly despite his intention to remain detached. "How did you get here? This place is 15 miles from the nearest town." The woman stopped moving but kept her body positioned to run, if necessary. "I walked," she said simply, as if walking 15 miles across desert terrain was a perfectly normal activity. Marcus looked down at her bare feet, noting the cuts and bruises that confirmed she was telling the truth. "You walked 15 miles barefoot across the desert?" The incredulity in his voice was genuine. Such a journey would be dangerous, even for an experienced hiker with proper equipment. "I lost my shoes," the woman explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone took them." The casual way she mentioned having her shoes stolen suggested that such losses were routine in her life. Marcus felt another unwelcome stirring of sympathy, remembering the stories Carol had told him about women who lived in constant fear of having their few possessions taken by those who controlled their circumstances. "What's your name?" Marcus asked, surprising himself with the question. He'd intended to simply escort the trespasser off his property, not engage in conversation that might lead to involvement in her problems. The woman hesitated, as if deciding whether honesty or deception would be safer. "Sarah," she said finally. "Sarah Chun." Marcus noted the Asian surname paired with her obviously Caucasian features, suggesting that either she was of mixed heritage or the name wasn't entirely accurate. Given her circumstances, he suspected the latter but didn't challenge her on it. "I'm Marcus Stone," he said, then immediately wondered why he'd bothered with introductions. "This is my family's ranch. That chapel you were praying in belongs to my great-grandfather." Sarah's eyes widened with what appeared to be genuine remorse. "I didn't know it was a family place. I wouldn't have. I was just looking for somewhere quiet to pray, and when I saw the cross on top of the building, I thought it might be okay." Marcus looked around the chapel's interior for the first time in years, seeing it through the eyes of a desperate woman seeking sanctuary. Sarah had lit several candles and arranged them on what had once been the altar, creating a warm, sacred atmosphere that reminded him of the services his grandmother had conducted here during his childhood. The building was in worse condition than he'd realized. Years of neglect had left gaps in the roof that allowed rain to enter, warping the wooden pews and staining the walls with water damage. But Sarah had obviously made an effort to clean the space around the altar, moving debris, and arranging the surviving furniture in a configuration that restored some dignity to the abandoned sanctuary. "How long have you been here?" Marcus asked, noting signs that suggested she'd been using the chapel for more than just tonight's prayer session. 3 days, Sarah admitted, her voice filled with shame. "I know I should have asked permission, but I didn't know who owned the land, and She trailed off, apparently unable to explain her circumstances without revealing more than she was comfortable sharing. Marcus studied her face, reading the exhaustion and desperation that she was trying unsuccessfully to hide. 3 days in. An abandoned building without food or proper shelter would be difficult for anyone, but particularly challenging for someone who appeared to be recovering from recent trauma. "When did you last eat?" he asked, the question emerging from some vestige of basic human decency that had survived his years of cynicism. Sarah's hesitation confirmed his suspicion that she was hungry. "I had some crackers yesterday," she said. "Or maybe the day before. I'm not sure." The admission hit Marcus like a physical blow, reminding him of similar statements Carol Manning had documented from trafficking victims who'd been deliberately kept weak through starvation and exhaustion. Sarah's situation might not be identical, but the signs of systematic abuse were unmistakable. "There's a kitchen in the main house," Marcus found himself saying. "I could make you something to eat." The offer surprised him as much as it did Sarah. For 8 years, he'd carefully avoided becoming involved in other people's problems, learning that good intentions often led to complications he wasn't equipped to handle. But something about Sarah's desperate prayer and obvious vulnerability had penetrated the defensive barriers he'd built around his emotions. "I don't want to impose," Sarah said, though her eyes reflected the hunger she was trying to conceal. "You've already been more kind than I deserved." "It's just food," Marcus replied gruffly, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Nothing special about feeding someone who's hungry." Sarah looked at him with an expression of wonder that suggested acts of simple kindness were rare in her experience. "Are you sure? I don't want to cause you any trouble." Marcus was far from sure. Every instinct he'd developed over the past 8 years warned him against getting involved with a stranger whose problems were obviously complex and potentially dangerous. But the sight of her praying in his family's chapel had stirred memories of his grandmother's teachings about Christian charity and the obligation to help those in need. "Come on," he said, turning toward the door before he could change his mind. "Let's get you fed." Sarah followed him out of the chapel, moving with the careful steps of someone whose feet were painful from her barefoot desert journey. The walk to the main house took longer than usual as Marcus adjusted his pace to accommodate her injuries. The Stone family home felt different with another person inside it. Marcus rarely entered the building anymore, preferring the isolation of the foreman's cabin to the memories that haunted every room of his childhood residence. But Sarah's presence somehow changed the atmosphere, making the spaces feel less like a mausoleum and more like an actual home. "This is beautiful," Sarah said softly as they entered the kitchen, her voice filled with genuine appreciation for the handcrafted cabinets and authentic southwestern tiles that had been installed by Marcus's grandfather. "It feels like a place where families gather, where people take care of each other." Her observation was more accurate than she knew. For 3 generations, the Stone family kitchen had been the heart of the household, where important decisions were discussed and celebrations were planned. Marcus's grandmother had cooked countless meals for family, ranch hands, and community members in need, believing that sharing food was one of the most fundamental expressions of Christian love. Marcus opened the refrigerator and surveyed its contents, realizing that his bachelor lifestyle had left him with limited options for preparing a proper meal. "I can make eggs and toast," he offered. "Maybe some bacon if you eat meat." "Anything would be wonderful," Sarah replied, settling carefully onto one of the kitchen chairs. "I'm not particular about food." As Marcus began preparing the meal, he found himself stealing glances at Sarah, noting details that painted a disturbing picture of her recent experiences. Her dress was clean but showed signs of repeated washing and careful mending. Her hair was well-groomed despite her obvious lack of resources, suggesting she took pride in her appearance even under difficult circumstances. Most troubling were the fading bruises on her arms and the careful way she moved, as if certain positions or gestures caused pain. Marcus had seen similar injuries on domestic violence victims during his time as sheriff, and the pattern was unmistakable. "Where did you come from?" Marcus asked as he cracked eggs into a hot skillet. "Before you walked 15 miles across the desert, I mean." Sarah was quiet for so long that Marcus thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of shame and regret that he recognized from his own internal monologue. "Phoenix," she said simply. "I was in Phoenix." Marcus waited for her to elaborate, but she seemed determined to share as little information as possible about her circumstances. He understood the impulse, his own reluctance to discuss. His past had become second nature over the years. "That's a long way from here," he observed. "Did someone drive you part way?" Sarah's laugh contained no humor. "You could say that. Someone dropped me off at a truck stop about 20 miles from here. Said I could find my own way from there." The casual cruelty of abandoning someone without shoes or money at a desert truck stop struck Marcus as particularly vicious. Whoever had dropped off Sarah had essentially sentenced her to death, knowing that 20 miles across Arizona wilderness was beyond the survival capacity of most people. "Why?" Marcus asked, then immediately regretted the question. Sarah's business was her own, and he had no right to interrogate her about circumstances she was obviously reluctant to discuss. "Because I tried to leave," Sarah answered, her voice barely audible. "Because I thought I could be something different than what they wanted me to be." The simple statement contained volumes of information about Sarah's situation. She'd been controlled by people who had specific expectations about her behavior and had punished her for attempting to assert independence. The pattern was familiar. From trafficking cases, where victims who tried to escape often faced retribution designed to discourage future attempts at freedom. Marcus served the eggs and toast, adding strips of crispy bacon that filled the kitchen with aroma that reminded him of childhood mornings when his grandmother had prepared similar meals. Sarah stared at the plate as if she couldn't believe it was really for her. "Thank you," she whispered. This is more kindness than I've experienced in a very long time." Marcus felt uncomfortable with her gratitude, recognizing in it the same desperate appreciation he'd heard from trafficking victims, who'd been systematically deprived of basic human dignity. "It's just breakfast," he said gruffly. "Nothing to get emotional about." But as he watched Sarah eat with the careful restraint of someone who'd learned not to waste food, Marcus realized that his simple act of cooking the meal represented something much more significant to someone whose humanity had been consistently denied. Sarah ate slowly, savoring each bite while maintaining the posture of someone ready to flee if the situation changed suddenly. Her obvious fear and gratitude forced Marcus to confront questions he'd been avoiding for 8 years about his own retreat from helping others, and the moral implications of choosing isolation over engagement with human suffering. The woman praying in his chapel had been seeking redemption from a God Marcus no longer believed was listening. But as he watched her struggle with trust and hope despite obvious trauma, Marcus began to wonder if the real question wasn't whether God offered redemption, but whether broken people could offer it to each other. Outside, the Arizona desert stretched endlessly under a star-filled sky, indifferent to human struggles for meaning and grace. But inside the Stone family kitchen, 2 damaged souls were beginning a conversation that would challenge everything they thought they knew about forgiveness, second chances, and the possibility that healing might still be possible even after faith itself had been shattered. The first rays of sunrise painted the Arizona sky in shades of amber and rose as Marcus sat on his front porch, nursing his third cup of coffee and trying to make sense of the previous night's events. Sarah had fallen asleep at his kitchen table halfway through her meal, exhaustion finally overcoming the adrenaline that had kept her alert during their initial encounter. Marcus had carried her to the guest bedroom in the main house, the first time anyone had slept in that room since his sister's last visit 3 years ago. Now, watching the desert come alive with the sounds of cattle stirring and ranch hands beginning their daily routines, Marcus found himself questioning every decision he'd made in the past 8 hours. His carefully constructed isolation had been shattered by a desperate woman seeking grace in an abandoned chapel, and he wasn't sure whether he'd acted from compassion or simple loneliness. The sound of approaching vehicles pulled Marcus from his introspection. 2 black SUVs with tinted windows were making their way up his private road, moving with the purposeful speed of people who had serious business to conduct. Marcus recognized the vehicle style immediately: federal law enforcement, private security, or organized crime. In his experience, the distinction between those categories was often smaller than most people believed. Marcus set down his coffee cup and walked toward the vehicles, his hand instinctively moving to the .45 caliber pistol he wore on his hip. 8 years of rural isolation hadn't dulled his law enforcement instincts, and everything about this early morning visit suggested trouble. The lead SUV stopped 50 yards from the house, close enough for conversation, but far enough to provide maneuvering room if the situation deteriorated. 4 men emerged from the 2 vehicles, all wearing expensive suits that looked out of place in the desert setting. Their bearing and coordination marked them as professionals, though whether they represented legitimate law enforcement or something more sinister remained unclear. The leader of the group was a tall, lean man in his 40s with silver hair and cold blue eyes that reminded Marcus of winter mornings when the desert frost could kill unwary cattle. He approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to having his authority respected without question. "Mr. Stone," the man called out when he was within conversational distance. "I'm Special Agent Robert Hayes with the FBI. We're looking for someone who might have passed through your area recently." Marcus studied Hayes' identification when it was offered, noting that it appeared genuine but knowing that sophisticated forgeries were readily available to people with sufficient resources. "What kind of someone?" Hayes gestured to one of his companions, who produced a photograph and handed it to Marcus. The image showed Sarah Chun, though it had clearly been taken under different circumstances. In the photo, she was heavily made up and wearing revealing clothing that suggested the picture's origin was connected to whatever life she'd been trying to escape. "Her name is Lily Wong," Hayes continued, using a different name than Sarah had given Marcus. "She's wanted for questioning in connection with several serious felonies, including theft, fraud, and conspiracy. We have reason to believe she might be in this area." Marcus examined the photograph carefully, noting that despite the different styling and makeup, the woman was unmistakably the same person who was currently sleeping in his guest bedroom. "What makes you think she'd be out here?" "Ms. Wong was last seen at a truck stop 20 miles east of here," Hayes explained. "Local authorities tracked her movements to this general area before losing the trail. We're conducting a systematic search of all properties in the region." The story aligned with what Sarah had told Marcus about being abandoned at a truck stop, but the federal involvement suggested her situation was more complex than a simple case of domestic abuse or trafficking. Marcus kept his expression neutral, while his mind raced through the implications of harboring a federal fugitive. "Haven't seen anyone matching that description," Marcus lied smoothly, his years of law enforcement experience helping him maintain credibility under pressure. "But then again, I don't get many visitors out here." Hayes studied Marcus's face with the intense scrutiny of someone trained to detect deception. "Mr. Stone, I should mention that harboring a federal fugitive is a serious crime, punishable by up to 5 years in federal prison. If you have any information about Ms. Wong's whereabouts, now would be the time to share it. The threat was delivered with professional courtesy, but its implications were unmistakable. Marcus found himself facing the same type of moral choice that had defined his resignation from the sheriff's department: cooperate with authorities who might not represent justice, or protect someone who might not deserve protection. Like I said, Agent Hayes, I haven't seen anyone matching that description, but I'll certainly contact you if that changes. Hayes nodded slowly, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by Marcus's denial. We'll be conducting a thorough search of the area over the next few days. If Ms. Wong is hiding somewhere in this region, we'll find her. The agents returned to their vehicles and drove away, but not before one of them made a point of photographing Marcus's license plates and the exterior of his house. The message was clear: Marcus Stone was now a person of interest in their investigation, and his activities would be monitored accordingly. Marcus waited until the SUVs disappeared from view before returning to the house. He found Sarah awake and standing at the kitchen window, her face pale with terror as she watched the dust clouds left by the departing vehicles. "They found me," she whispered, her voice filled with the hopeless resignation of someone who'd believed escape was impossible. "I should never have stayed. I should never have put you in danger." Marcus poured himself another cup of coffee, using the mundane action to buy time while he processed the morning's revelations. "Those men called you Lily Wong. They said you were wanted for theft and fraud." Sarah, or Lily, closed her eyes as if preparing for a blow. "That's not my real name either. My real name is Rachel Martinez. Lily Wong was who they made me become." The admission contained layers of meaning that Marcus was only beginning to understand. "Who is they?" Rachel moved to the kitchen table and sat down heavily, her hands shaking as she struggled to find words for experiences that defied easy explanation. 3 years ago, I was a college student in Phoenix. I was studying to be a teacher, working part-time at a restaurant to pay for school. I was normal. I had plans for my future. Marcus settled into the chair across from her, recognizing the beginning of a story that would probably challenge his remaining assumptions about justice and victimization. "I met a man named David Kim at the restaurant where I worked," Rachel continued. "He was charming, well-dressed, generous with tips. He said he owned several businesses and was impressed by my work ethic. He offered me a better job, more money, flexible hours that would let me continue my studies." Marcus had heard similar stories during his time as sheriff. Young women recruited through offers of legitimate employment that gradually transformed into something much darker. "Let me guess, the job wasn't what he promised." "At first it was," Rachel said, her voice growing stronger as she forced herself to relive painful memories. "I worked as a hostess at an upscale restaurant David claimed to own. The pay was good, the hours were reasonable, and I was able to maintain my course load. For about 6 weeks, I thought I'd found the perfect solution to my financial problems." She paused, gathering courage for the harder parts of her story. "Then David said the restaurant was having cash flow problems and asked if I'd be willing to help with some additional work. Private parties, he called them. Events where wealthy men needed attractive hostesses to make their gatherings more sophisticated." Marcus felt a familiar anger building in his chest, the same rage he'd experienced when listening to Carol Manning describe the systematic exploitation of vulnerable women. And those private parties weren't what they seemed either. "The first few were actually legitimate," Rachel admitted. "Boring business dinners where I served drinks and made small talk with middle-aged executives. David paid me well for those events, and I started to believe I was just being paranoid about his motives." She looked out the window toward the desert, as if drawing strength from the vast emptiness beyond the ranch boundaries. But gradually, the expectations changed. The men at these parties became more aggressive, more demanding. David started suggesting that accommodating their requests would be appreciated, that my continued employment depended on keeping the client satisfied. Marcus had investigated enough trafficking cases to understand the incremental process by which women were drawn into exploitation. The gradual escalation, the financial dependency, the isolation from support systems, all designed to make resistance seem impossible and escape unthinkable. "How did you end up with a federal warrant?" Marcus asked gently. Rachel's laugh was bitter and humorless. "Because David and his organization were sophisticated criminals who understood how to protect themselves. When they forced me into more explicit activities, they made sure to document everything. Photos, videos, financial records that made it look like I was a willing participant in their business." She wiped tears from her eyes before continuing. "They created an entire identity for me, Lily Wong, supposedly the daughter of Chinese immigrants, with fabricated documentation and a manufactured history. Lily had bank accounts, credit cards, even a social security number. Everything was designed to make it look like I was a partner in their operation, not a victim." Marcus understood the diabolical cleverness of the scheme. By creating documentation that suggested Rachel was a willing participant in criminal activities, her captors had effectively neutralized her ability to seek help from law enforcement. Any attempt to report her situation would be met with evidence that she was complicit in the crimes being committed. And the federal charges? Money laundering primarily. David's organization used women like me to move large amounts of cash through the banking system. We'd make deposits, transfers, and withdrawals that looked like legitimate business transactions, but were actually designed to hide the proceeds from their various criminal enterprises. Rachel stood and walked to the window again, staring out at the horizon with the expression of someone who'd learned to expect pursuit from every direction. "I didn't understand what I was doing at first. David told me the transactions were related to his restaurant business, and I was desperate to believe him, because the alternative was admitting that I'd become something I never thought I could become." Marcus felt a familiar sense of outrage at the systematic way innocent people could be manipulated and destroyed by those with power and resources. Rachel's story was different from Carol Manning's investigation, but it shared the same themes of corruption, exploitation, and the way legal systems could be manipulated to protect criminals while destroying their victims. "How did you escape?" "I didn't escape," Rachel corrected him. "I was discarded. 3 months ago, federal agents raided one of David's operations. Several of his associates were arrested, and it became clear that someone was providing information to law enforcement. David decided that the women in his organization had become liabilities." She turned away from the window to face Marcus directly. "Most of the other women simply disappeared. I only survived because a federal agent named Jennifer Walsh took pity on me and arranged for me to be relocated rather than arrested. She told me to disappear, change my appearance, and never contact anyone from my old life." Marcus processed this information, trying to reconcile it with the federal agents who'd just visited his ranch. "If this Agent Walsh helped you escape, why are other federal agents looking for you now?" Rachel's expression grew grim. "Because Agent Walsh was killed 2 weeks ago. A car accident, according to the official report. But David Kim's organization has connections throughout law enforcement, and I suspect they discovered her involvement in my escape." The implications were staggering. If Rachel was telling the truth, then the federal agents who'd visited Marcus's ranch might not represent legitimate law enforcement at all. They could be part of the same criminal organization that had exploited her using federal credentials to track down a witness who could expose their activities. "The agents who were here," Marcus said slowly, "you think they're working for David Kim?" "I think David Kim has enough money and influence to buy whatever kind of cooperation he needs," Rachel replied. "And I think anyone who helps me becomes a target for the same people who killed Agent Walsh." Marcus stood and walked to his gun cabinet, removing a shotgun that he began loading with deliberate movements. If Rachel's assessment was accurate, Then his ranch was no longer a sanctuary, but a battlefield where the stakes included both their lives. "Then we'd better get ready," Marcus said grimly. "Because something tells me those agents aren't going to give up after one polite conversation." Outside, the Arizona sun climbed higher into a cloudless sky, promising another day of merciless heat in a landscape that had witnessed countless struggles between predators and prey. But inside the Stone family home, two people who'd lost faith in justice were preparing to fight for something that might represent a chance at redemption for them. Both. The morning's confrontation had forced Marcus to choose between his comfortable isolation and the dangerous uncertainty of protecting someone who might not deserve salvation. Rachel's presence had already cost him his anonymity and possibly his safety. But as he checked the shotgun's action and prepared for whatever came next, Marcus realized that for the first time in 8 years, he felt like he was fighting for something that mattered more than his own bitterness. Whether that made him a hero or a fool remained to be seen. Marcus spent the next hour making phone calls to contacts he hadn't spoken to in 8 years, reaching out to the handful of law enforcement officers he still trusted from his days as sheriff. The conversations were awkward and painful, forcing him to explain his sudden interest in federal operations without revealing Rachel's presence on his ranch. The information he gathered painted a disturbing picture that confirmed Rachel's worst fears. Former Deputy Sheriff Tom Rodriguez, now working for the Arizona State Police, provided the most useful intelligence. "Marcus, I've been hearing some strange things about federal operations in our area," Tom said during their encrypted conversation. "There's supposed to be a joint task force working trafficking cases, but their methods don't match any federal protocols I know about." Marcus gripped the phone tighter. "What kind of methods?" "Aggressive surveillance, intimidation tactics, using local resources without proper authorization. Word is they're looking for a specific individual, a woman involved in some kind of money laundering operation. But the way they're going about it feels more like a manhunt than a legitimate investigation." "Have you met any of these federal agents personally?" Tom paused before answering. "That's the strange part. Nobody I've talked to has actually verified their credentials through official channels. They show up with the right badges and paperwork. But when we try to coordinate through normal federal liaison offices, nobody seems to know anything about their operation." The confirmation of Rachel's suspicions sent a chill down Marcus's spine. If the men who'd visited his ranch weren't legitimate federal agents, then their resources and determination suggested they represented something far more dangerous than conventional law enforcement. "Tom, I need a favor," Marcus said carefully. "Can you run a background check on someone named David Kim? Supposedly operates businesses in Phoenix, might have connections to organized crime." "I can try, but if this guy is connected to whatever operation is running around our area, you might want to be careful about showing too much interest." After ending the call, Marcus found Rachel in the living room, staring at family photographs that lined the mantelpiece. She was examining a picture of Marcus in his sheriff's uniform, taken during his swearing-in ceremony 9 years ago. "You were law enforcement," she said without turning around. It wasn't a question. "Sheriff of Millbrook County for 18 months. Marcus confirmed. "Until I figured out that the badge doesn't always represent justice." Rachel turned to face him, and Marcus saw something new in her expression, a flicker of hope that hadn't been there before. "Why did you quit?" Marcus settled into his father's old recliner, feeling the weight of memories he'd spent 8 years trying to suppress. "Because I discovered that some crimes are too big to fight, and some criminals have too much protection to touch." "What happened?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying the same weight as Rachel's earlier confession about her own past. Marcus realized that if he expected her to trust him with her life, he owed her the truth about why he'd abandoned his oath to serve and protect. "I had a deputy named Carol Manning," Marcus began slowly. "Best cop I ever worked with. She was investigating a trafficking ring that operated along the border. bringing women up from Mexico and Central America for forced labor and prostitution. Rachel sat down on the couch, her attention completely focused on Marcus's story. She understood better than most people the courage it took to investigate such operations and the dangers faced by those who tried to expose them. Carol uncovered evidence that several prominent local officials were involved in the operation, people with enough power to make investigations disappear and witnesses vanish. When she brought the evidence to me, I encouraged her to continue her work. I thought we could bypass local corruption by taking the case directly to state or federal authorities. Marcus paused, feeling the familiar weight of guilt settling over him. Carol died in a car accident before she could present her evidence. Single vehicle crash on a road she'd driven hundreds of times, in perfect weather conditions. The investigation concluded she fell asleep at the wheel, but you knew better. I knew Carol never fell asleep on duty. I knew she was careful and experienced. And I knew that all her files related to the trafficking investigation disappeared from the sheriff's department within days of her death. Rachel leaned forward, understanding the parallel between Marcus's story and her own experiences with corruption and cover-ups. What did you do? Nothing, Marcus said bitterly. I realized that fighting the system would just get more good people killed while the guilty remained untouchable. So I quit, came back to the ranch, and spent 8 years convincing myself that isolation was preferable to futile resistance. The admission hung between them like a confession of cowardice, though Rachel's expression showed understanding rather than judgment. They were both people who'd been broken by their encounters with overwhelming evil, forced to choose between resistance and survival. The men who came here this morning, Rachel said quietly, they reminded me of the people who controlled my life for 3 years. They have the same confidence, the same certainty that they can do whatever they want without consequences. Marcus nodded grimly, which means we're not dealing with legitimate law enforcement. We're dealing with David Kim's organization, and they've apparently decided you're worth considerable effort to recapture. Because I know too much about their operation to be allowed to remain free, Rachel concluded. Agent Walsh told me that my testimony could bring down a network that extends across multiple states and involves dozens of corrupt officials. The scope of what they were facing began to crystallize in Marcus's mind. They weren't just hiding from a local criminal organization. They were confronting a sophisticated network with resources that included false federal credentials, advanced surveillance capabilities, and apparent immunity from normal law enforcement interference. We need help, Marcus said, reaching for his phone again. People we can trust, who understand how to fight this kind of enemy. Who can you trust after 8 years of isolation? It was a fair question that Marcus had been wrestling with since the morning's confrontation. His retreat from public life had severed most of his professional relationships, leaving him with a limited network of people who might be willing to risk their careers or safety to help. A disgraced former sheriff and a federal fugitive. There's someone, Marcus said slowly, thinking of a name he hadn't spoken in years. Maria Santos. She's a federal prosecutor in Tucson, specializes in organized crime cases. She tried to recruit Carol Manning for a joint task force just before Carol died. Can you trust her? Marcus considered the question carefully. Maria Santos had been one of the few federal officials who'd shown genuine interest in Carol's trafficking investigation, and her subsequent attempts to contact Marcus after Carol's death had suggested she suspected official involvement in the deputy's murder. I think she's one of the good ones, Marcus said. And if Rachel Martinez is going to have any chance of a normal life, she needs legitimate federal protection, not just a place to hide. Rachel stood and walked to the window, scanning the horizon for signs of surveillance or approaching vehicles. The morning's visit had left them both hyper-aware of their vulnerability in the isolated ranch setting. What if contacting this prosecutor puts us both in more danger? What if David Kim's organization has people inside the federal prosecutor's office too? The possibility was real and frightening. If their enemies had sufficient resources to impersonate federal agents, they might also have the capability to monitor communications with legitimate law enforcement officials. Then we're already dead, Marcus said bluntly. Rachel, you can't spend the rest of your life running from these people. Eventually they'll find you, and when they do, you'll face something much worse than death. Rachel turned away from the window, her expression reflecting the internal struggle between hope and despair that had characterized her entire adult life. What makes you think this prosecutor will believe our story? What makes you think she'll be willing to risk her career to help people like us? Because Maria Santos became a federal prosecutor for the same reason I became a sheriff, Marcus replied. She believed in justice. And if she's anything like the woman I remember, she understands that sometimes protecting justice requires taking risks that bureaucrats wouldn't approve. Marcus reached for his secure satellite phone, a piece of equipment he'd purchased during his more paranoid days but never actually used. If they were going to contact Maria Santos, they needed to do it in a way that couldn't be easily monitored by hostile forces. Before we make this call, Marcus said, you need to understand what we're committing to. Once we reach out to federal authorities, there's no going back to hiding. We'll be choosing to fight, which means accepting all the risks that come with challenging people who've already demonstrated their willingness to kill. Rachel looked around the living room that had become her temporary sanctuary, taking in the family photographs and personal mementos that spoke of generations of honest people living principled lives. The contrast with her own recent experiences was stark and painful. I'm tired of running, she said finally. I'm tired of being afraid, tired of letting evil people control my life through fear. If there's a chance to fight back, to maybe prevent other women from going through what I experienced, then I want to take it. Marcus felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced in 8 years, the sense of purpose that had originally drawn him to law enforcement. The opportunity to stand up for justice, to protect the innocent, and to prove that good people could still make a difference when they chose courage over comfort. Then let's make the call, Marcus said, beginning to dial Maria Santos's number. From memory. As the phone rang, Marcus realized that he was crossing a threshold that would change his life forever. For 8 years he'd chosen isolation and bitterness over engagement and hope. Rachel's arrival had forced him to confront the possibility that redemption might still be possible, not just for her, but for himself as well. The call connected, and Marcus heard the familiar voice of a woman who represented their best hope for legitimate justice in a world that seemed increasingly controlled by corruption and violence. Maria Santos speaking. Maria, this is Marcus Stone, former sheriff of Millbrook County. I think we need to talk. The conversation that followed would determine whether two broken people could find redemption through their shared commitment to fighting injustice, or whether their attempt to challenge a powerful criminal organization would result in their destruction. But for the first time since Carol Manning's death, Marcus felt like he was choosing the right side of a battle that mattered. Whatever happened next, he would face it as someone who'd chosen courage over cowardice, engagement over isolation. The desert sun climbed toward its zenith outside the Stone family home, promising another day of relentless heat in a landscape that had witnessed countless struggles between predators and prey. But inside the house, two people who'd lost faith in justice were preparing to reclaim it, through their willingness to risk everything for the chance to make things right. Their conversation with Maria Santos would either provide them with the allies they needed to fight David Kim's organization, or confirm that corruption had penetrated so deeply into the system that resistance was truly futile. Either way, Marcus Stone was no longer the broken man who'd resigned his badge in defeat. 8 years ago, Rachel Martinez had given him something worth fighting for, and he intended to prove worthy of the trust she'd placed in him. The real battle was just beginning, but for the first time in years, Marcus felt like he was on the right side of the fight. Maria Santos's voice carried the same sharp intelligence Marcus remembered from their brief interactions years ago. But there was a new wariness that hadn't been there during her attempts to collaborate with Carol Manning's investigation. 8 years in federal prosecution had apparently taught her to be suspicious of unexpected contact from former law enforcement officers with complicated histories. Marcus Stone, Maria repeated slowly. I haven't heard from you since you resigned from the sheriff's department. What's this about? Marcus glanced at Rachel, who was listening intently from the couch, her expression tense with the knowledge that this conversation might determine whether she lived or died as a free woman. I have information about a trafficking and money laundering operation that you've probably been investigating. And I have a witness who can provide testimony that could bring down the entire network. The line was quiet for several seconds before Maria responded. Marcus, I need you to understand that this conversation is being recorded, and anything you tell me may be used in subsequent legal proceedings. Are you prepared to continue under those circumstances? I wouldn't have called if I wasn't ready to make this official, Marcus replied. But I need to know that you're still the same person who tried to help Carol Manning expose corruption in my county. Maria's intake of breath was audible over the phone. You're talking about Deputy Manning's investigation into border trafficking. That case file was sealed after her death, classified as an ongoing federal investigation. How do you know about the details of her work? Because Carol shared everything with me before she was murdered, Marcus said bluntly. And because the woman sitting in my living room right now is one of the victims of the same organization Carol was investigating. Another long pause, during which Marcus could hear the sound of computer keys clicking as Maria presumably accessed classified files or cross-referenced information in federal databases. Marcus, I'm going to need you to be very specific about what you're claiming. Are you saying that Deputy Manning's death was connected to her investigation, and that you currently have a witness from the trafficking operation in your possession? I'm saying that Carol Manning was murdered by the same people who are now using fake federal credentials to hunt for my witness. And I'm saying that if you want to finally get justice for Carol and dozens of other victims, you need to listen to what Rachel Martinez has to tell you. Maria's tone shifted, becoming more urgent and focused. Rachel Martinez. That name appeared in intelligence reports related to David Kim's organization. She was believed to be dead. Rachel leaned closer to the phone, her voice barely above him. Whisper as she spoke. Agent Jennifer Walsh helped me escape 3 months ago. She told me to disappear completely, never contact anyone from my old life. But Agent Walsh was killed 2 weeks ago, and now they're using federal badges to track me down. Jennifer Walsh, Maria breathed. Jesus Christ. Jennifer was working an undercover operation for my task force. Her death was. We suspected it. Wasn't accidental, but we couldn't prove murder. The confirmation that Agent Walsh had been working for Maria's task force provided the first concrete evidence that they were dealing with legitimate law enforcement rather than another layer of the criminal conspiracy. Rachel's shoulders sagged with relief as she realized she might finally have found someone in authority who would believe her story. Ms. Martinez, Maria continued, if you're really alive and willing to testify, you represent the break we've been looking for in a case that's consumed my office for the past 2 years. But I need to warn you that David Kim's organization has resources that extend into federal law enforcement. Your safety can't be guaranteed through normal witness protection protocols. Marcus leaned forward, his law enforcement experience helping him understand the implications of Maria's warning. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that if Rachel Martinez is going to survive long enough to testify, she needs protection from people who aren't connected to any official law enforcement database. People who can't be traced through normal channels. You're talking about private security. I'm talking about a small group of former federal agents who work off the books for cases like this. People who've been burned by corruption in their own agencies and understand the stakes when criminals have penetrated law enforcement institutions. Rachel looked between Marcus and the phone, struggling to process the complexity of what they were facing. She'd hoped that contacting legitimate federal authorities would provide simple solutions to her problems, but it was becoming clear that her situation required measures that existed in the gray areas between legal and illegal. How do we know we can trust these off-the-books agents? Marcus asked practically. For all we know, they could be working for David Kim too. Because I handpicked them myself, Maria replied. They're people who've lost colleagues to the same kind of corruption you encountered in Millbrook County. They have personal reasons for wanting to see David Kim's organization destroyed. Maria paused, and Marcus could hear the sound of papers shuffling as she consulted files or notes. Marcus, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Are you prepared to trust me with Rachel's life? The question cut to the heart of everything Marcus had struggled with since his resignation from the sheriff's department. Trusting authority figures meant accepting the possibility of betrayal, but refusing to trust meant condemning Rachel to a life of perpetual flight from enemies who would never stop hunting her. 8 years ago, I stopped trusting anyone in law enforcement because I learned that good intentions aren't enough to protect people from systematic corruption, Marcus said slowly. But Rachel deserves better than spending her life hiding from the truth. If you think your people can keep her alive long enough to testify, then yes, I'm prepared to trust you. Rachel reached over and took Marcus's hand, squeezing it with gratitude and terror in equal measure. She understood that this decision would either lead to her freedom or her death, with no middle ground between those outcomes. All right, Maria, said with the decisive tone of someone making a commitment that would define her career. Here's what we're going to do. I'm sending 2 agents to your location, former FBI agents named Jackson Rivers and Elena Vasquez. They'll arrive tonight and escort Rachel to a secure location where she can provide formal testimony without risk of surveillance or interference. What about the fake federal agents who visited this morning? Marcus asked. They're going to be watching my property, probably monitoring communications. Jackson and Elena specialize in situations where standard law enforcement protocols have been compromised. They'll know how to approach your ranch without being detected, and they'll be prepared to deal with hostile surveillance. Maria's confidence was reassuring, but Marcus's experience with law enforcement had taught him to prepare for contingencies that optimistic prosecutors didn't always consider. And if something goes wrong, if your people are compromised, or if David Kim's organization has better intelligence than we're assuming, then you and Rachel will need to be prepared to defend yourselves until backup arrives, Maria said bluntly. Marcus, I'm not going to lie to you about the risks. David Kim's organization has killed federal agents, local law enforcement officers, and civilians who posed threats to their operation. They won't hesitate to eliminate both of you if they determine that Rachel's testimony presents an unacceptable risk. The stark honesty of Maria's assessment forced Marcus to confront the full magnitude of what they were undertaking. By choosing to fight rather than hide, they were essentially declaring war on an organization that had already demonstrated its willingness to kill anyone who challenged its interests. How long do we have? Rachel asked, her voice steady despite the fear Marcus could see in her eyes. Jackson and Elena will arrive at your location around midnight, Maria replied. That gives you approximately 12 hours to prepare for extraction. Use that time to gather anything Rachel needs for an extended stay in protective custody, and be ready for the possibility that you might need to leave immediately if the situation deteriorates. Marcus looked around the living room that had been his sanctuary for 8 years, realizing that by morning he might never see his family home again. The decision to help Rachel had already cost him his anonymity and possibly his safety. It might also cost him the last connection to his heritage and identity. "Maria," Marcus said, "there's something else you need to know. David Kim's organization didn't just send fake federal agents to my ranch this morning. They've been conducting systematic surveillance of the entire region, using resources that suggest they have significant backing from somewhere." "What kind of backing?" "The kind that allows them to operate with federal credentials, conduct searches without warrants, and intimidate local law enforcement into cooperation. This isn't just a criminal organization, it's a criminal organization with institutional protection." Maria was quiet for several moments, processing the implications of Marcus's observation. "That aligns with intelligence we've gathered about David Kim's operation. We believe his organization has corrupted officials at multiple levels of government, including federal agencies that are supposed to be investigating them. Which means Rachel's testimony isn't just valuable for prosecuting trafficking crimes." Marcus realized it's evidence of systematic corruption that extends throughout law enforcement and government. Exactly. And that's why David Kim's people are willing to take extraordinary risks to silence her. Rachel Martinez isn't just a witness to individual crimes, she's evidence of institutional failure that could bring down careers and political ambitions and expose corruption that reaches the highest levels of government. The scope of what they were challenging began to crystallize in Marcus's mind. They weren't just fighting a criminal organization, they were confronting a network of corruption that had infected the very institutions designed to protect society from such threats. "Are you still willing to proceed?" Maria asked, understanding that the revelation about institutional corruption might change their willingness to take risks. Rachel answered before Marcus could respond. "I've been a victim of this system for 3 years. If my testimony can prevent other women from experiencing what I went through, then I'm willing to face whatever risks come with telling the truth." Marcus felt a surge of admiration for Rachel's courage, recognizing in her determination the same commitment to justice that had originally drawn him to law enforcement. She was choosing to fight not just for her own freedom, but for the protection of others who couldn't fight for themselves. "Then we proceed," Marcus said firmly. "We'll be ready for your agents at midnight." "Marcus," Maria said as the call neared, "it's end. I want you to understand that after tonight, your life will never be the same. David Kim's organization doesn't forget, and they don't forgive. Even if we successfully prosecute them, you'll always be looking over your shoulder for reprisals." "I've been looking over my shoulder for 8 years anyway," Marcus replied. "At least now I'll be looking for something other than my own ghosts." After ending the call, Marcus and Rachel sat in the living room silence, both processing the magnitude of what they'd committed to and the dangers they would face in the coming hours. "Are you having second thoughts?" Rachel asked quietly. Marcus considered the question seriously, understanding that he could still change his mind and return to the isolated existence that had protected him from exactly this kind of dangerous involvement. But as he looked at Rachel, a woman who'd endured 3 years of systematic abuse and was still willing to risk her life for justice, he realized that his 8 years of safe isolation had been a form of slow suicide. "No second thoughts," Marcus said. "For the first time in 8 years, I feel like I'm doing something that matters." Outside, the Arizona desert stretched endlessly under an afternoon sun that promised no mercy for those unprepared for its harsh realities. But inside the Stone family home, 2 people who'd been broken by their encounters with evil were preparing to fight back with everything they had. The next 12 hours would determine whether their courage was sufficient to challenge an organization that had corrupted institutions, murdered law enforcement officers, and destroyed countless lives in pursuit of profit and power. But as Marcus began preparations for what might be his final night in the home his family had built, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Carol Manning's death. The sense that he was finally on the right side of a fight that could make a difference, whether they lived or died. They would face their fate as people who'd chosen justice over safety, courage over comfort. For both Marcus and Rachel, that choice represented a form of redemption that had seemed impossible just days before. The hours between. Maria Santos's call in midnight crawled by with the agonizing slowness that comes before life-changing events. Marcus spent the time methodically preparing his ranch for what might become a battlefield, while Rachel struggled with memories that 3 years of survival had taught her to suppress. Marcus's preparations were thorough and grimly practical. He moved ammunition from his gun safe to strategic locations throughout the house, checked the security cameras he'd installed around the property perimeter, and tested the emergency communication equipment that could summon help from neighboring ranches if normal phone lines were compromised. The Stone family home had been built by his grandfather with an understanding that the Arizona desert could be a dangerous place for those unprepared to defend themselves. Thick adobe walls provided natural protection against small arms fire, while carefully positioned windows offered clear sight lines across the approaches to the house. What had once been designed to protect against cattle rustlers and bandits would now serve against a far more sophisticated enemy. Rachel found herself drawn to the family photographs that lined the living room mantelpiece, studying images that told the story of 4 generations of honest people living principled lives. The contrast with her own recent experiences was stark and painful, but also inspiring in a way she hadn't expected. "Your family built something beautiful here," she said as Marcus returned from checking the perimeter sensors for the 3rd time. In an hour, Marcus paused in his security preparations to look at the photographs Rachel was examining. "My great-grandfather started with nothing but determination and a belief that hard work could overcome any obstacle. Each generation added to what he built, always trying to leave something better for the next generation. What will you leave?" The question caught Marcus off guard, forcing him to consider a future beyond the immediate crisis they were facing. For 8 years, he'd lived day by day without planning for anything beyond basic survival and the maintenance of his ranch operations. "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "I'd given up thinking about legacy or contribution, but helping you fight for justice. Maybe that's something worth building on." Rachel moved to a photograph of Marcus in his sheriff's uniform, standing proudly beside Carol Manning at some kind of community event. Both officers looked young and optimistic, radiating the confidence of people who believed they could make a difference in the world. "You were happy then," Rachel observed. "We both were." Carol believed that law enforcement could be a force for justice, that good people in positions of authority could protect the innocent and hold the guilty accountable. "I wanted to believe that too. What changed your mind?" Marcus settled into his father's chair, feeling the weight of memories and regrets that had shaped the past 8 years of his life. "Carol's murder showed me that believing in justice isn't enough when evil has more resources than good. The people who killed her didn't just eliminate a threat, they sent a message that resistance would be met with overwhelming force." Rachel understood the psychological impact of such messages, having lived under similar threats for 3 years. "But you're resisting now. What's different?" Marcus considered the question carefully, trying to identify the precise moment when his despair had transformed into determination. "You prayed in my family's chapel, asking God for a chance at redemption. Maybe helping you fight for that chance is my own path to redemption. You think God led me to your ranch?" The question touched on faith issues that Marcus had avoided confronting since Carol's death. For 8 years, he'd operated under the assumption that either God didn't exist or didn't care about human suffering. But Rachel's desperate prayer in the abandoned chapel had stirred something in him that felt suspiciously like renewed hope. "I think sometimes broken people find each other when they need each other most," Marcus said carefully. "Whether that's divine intervention or random chance, I'm grateful it happened." They were interrupted by the sound of Marcus's secure satellite phone, which displayed an incoming call from an encrypted number. Marcus answered cautiously. aware that David Kim's organization might have acquired the technology to monitor even supposedly secure communications. "Mr. Stone, this is Jackson Rivers. Maria Santos asked me to contact you regarding extraction procedures for tonight's operation." The voice was crisp and professional, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to dangerous assignments. Marcus felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as he realized their federal protection was making contact ahead of schedule. "I'm here with Rachel Martinez," Marcus replied. "What do you need to know?" "We've been monitoring your property since this afternoon, and we've identified at least 6 surveillance positions maintained by hostile forces. David Kim's people have established a perimeter around your ranch, probably hoping to intercept our extraction attempt." The news that their enemies were already in position wasn't surprising, but it confirmed that the next few hours would be more dangerous than even Maria Santos had anticipated. "What's your plan for getting through their surveillance?" Marcus asked. "We're not going through their surveillance," Jackson replied. "We're going to eliminate it. Elena and I have spent the past 6 hours identifying every hostile position and planning coordinated strikes that will neutralize their overwatch capabilities." Rachel leaned closer to the phone, her expression tense with the knowledge that her rescue might require violence against people who'd already demonstrated their willingness to kill. "What do you need from us?" she asked. "At exactly 11:45 p.m. we need you to turn off all the lights in your house and move to the back bedroom on the ground floor. Stay away from windows and be prepared to move quickly when we give the signal." Jackson's instructions were precise and professional, but Marcus's law enforcement experience helped him read between the lines. The coordinated elimination of 6 surveillance positions would require military-level precision and firepower, suggesting that Jackson and Elena were far more than simple former FBI agents. "Jackson," Marcus said, "what's your background? Maria mentioned you were former FBI, but this sounds like special operations planning." "Former FBI, former Delta Force, former a lot of things," Jackson replied with dark humor. "Elena and I specialize in situations where normal law enforcement protocols have failed and extraordinary measures become necessary." The admission confirmed Marcus's suspicion that they were dealing with people who operated in the shadowy areas between law enforcement and military action. Such individuals were exactly what their situation required, but their involvement also suggested that the stakes were higher than anyone had initially acknowledged. "How dangerous is this going to be for the neighbors?" Marcus asked, thinking of the other ranch families who lived within miles of his property. "We've verified that the hostile surveillance teams are positioned well away from civilian populations," Jackson assured him. "Our strikes will be surgical and contain no risk to innocent bystanders." After ending the call, Marcus and Rachel sat in the living room, both processing the reality that their rescue would require a small-scale military operation conducted on American soil by people who existed outside normal legal frameworks. "Are you having second thoughts about this?" Marcus asked, giving Rachel one final opportunity to reconsider their course of action. Rachel looked around the room that had become her sanctuary, taking in the evidence of generations of honest living and principled choices. The contrast with the violence and corruption that had defined her recent life was stark, but it also reminded her of what was worth fighting to protect. 3 years ago, I was a college student studying to become a teacher," she said quietly. "I had dreams about helping children learn and grow, about making a positive difference in their lives. David Kim's organization took that away from me, turned me into something I never wanted to become." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the desert landscape that stretched endlessly under a star-filled sky. "If my testimony can prevent other women from losing their dreams the way I lost mine, then whatever risks we face tonight are worth taking." Marcus felt a surge of admiration for Rachel's courage and clarity of purpose. Despite everything she'd endured, she remained focused on protecting others rather than simply securing her own freedom. "Then we see this through," Marcus said, with finality. The next hour passed in quiet preparation as both Marcus and Rachel gathered the few personal items they would take with them into federal protection. For Marcus, this meant family photographs and legal documents that represented his connection to 4 generations of Arizona ranching. For Rachel, it meant the worn Bible she'd been clutching in the chapel and a small locket that contained the only photograph she had of herself before David Kim's organization had destroyed her original identity. At 11:30 p.m., Marcus began shutting down the house systems and securing the property for what might be an extended absence. The familiar routines of ranch management felt different now, charged with the knowledge that he might never return to perform them again. "Marcus," Rachel said as they moved toward the back bedroom, "I want you to know something. Whatever happens tonight, meeting you has given me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" "Hope. For 3 years, I believed that people like David Kim had won, that corruption and violence were stronger than goodness and justice. But watching you choose to help a stranger despite the risks, it reminded me that good people still exist." Marcus felt tears threatening as he realized that Rachel had given him exactly the same gift. Her willingness to trust him with her life had reminded him that courage and principle weren't meaningless concepts in a world controlled by power and greed. "We're going to get through this," Marcus said, though he wasn't certain he believed it. "And when we do, we're going to make sure David Kim's organization pays for every life they've destroyed." At exactly 11:45 p.m., Marcus turned off the last lights in the house and led Rachel to the back bedroom, where they settled in to wait for Jackson and Elena's signal. Outside, the Arizona desert was silent except for the sound of wind moving through the mesquite and sagebrush. But Marcus knew that silence was deceptive. Somewhere in the darkness, at least 6 armed men were maintaining surveillance on his property, while 2 former special operations agents prepared to eliminate them with military precision. The next 15 minutes would determine whether Rachel Martinez lived to tell her story or joined the long list of victims who'd been silenced by David Kim's organization. As they waited in the darkened bedroom, Marcus found himself thinking about Carol, Manning, and all the cases they'd never been able to solve together. Tonight's operation wouldn't bring Carol back, but it might finally provide justice for the crimes that had claimed her life. Rachel sat beside him in the darkness, clutching her Bible and whispering prayers that Marcus couldn't quite hear, but somehow found comforting. Her faith had survived 3 years of systematic abuse, while his had been shattered by a single betrayal of justice. Maybe faith wasn't about believing that God would prevent suffering, Marcus thought. Maybe it was about believing that suffering could be transformed into something meaningful through the choices people made in response to evil. The digital clock on the nightstand read 11:58 p.m. when the first distant gunshot shattered the desert silence. Jackson and Elena's operation had begun, and there was no turning back from whatever consequences would follow. Marcus tightened his grip on the shotgun he'd brought to the bedroom, while Rachel whispered a final prayer for the safety of people she'd never met who were risking their lives to save hers. Outside, a battle was beginning that would determine not just their immediate survival, but whether justice could still triumph over corruption in a world that had forgotten the difference between right and wrong. The gunshots that echoed across the desert came in rapid succession, 3 sharp cracks followed by 2 more, then silence. That stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Marcus and Rachel remained frozen in the back bedroom, listening to sounds that would determine whether they lived or died as free people. Marcus's secure phone buzzed with a text message. "Package secure. Proceed to extraction point Alpha in 60 seconds. "That's our signal," Marcus whispered, though he found himself reluctant to leave the relative safety of the darkened bedroom. Outside, professional killers had just been eliminated by people he'd never met, and he was about to trust his life and Rachel's to strangers who operated outside the law. Rachel stood first, clutching her small bag of possessions with hands that trembled despite her obvious effort to remain calm. I can't believe this is really happening. After 3 years of running and hiding, I'm finally going to be able to tell the truth. Marcus led the way through the house, moving by memory through rooms he'd known since childhood. The familiar spaces felt different now, charged with the knowledge that he might never see them again. By helping Rachel, he'd crossed a line that separated his old life of bitter isolation from an uncertain future, where he would be forever marked as an enemy of David Kim's organization. The extraction point was located in a grove of cottonwood trees near the ranch's eastern boundary, about half a mile from the main house. Marcus had chosen the location during his earlier conversation with Jackson Rivers because it offered concealment from surveillance while providing multiple escape routes if the extraction went wrong. As they approached the grove, Marcus could see 2 figures waiting in the shadows, tall man with military bearing and a compact woman whose posture suggested readiness for instant action. Jackson Rivers and Elena Vasquez looked exactly like what they were, highly trained professionals who specialized in situations where conventional law enforcement had failed. Mr. Stone, Ms. Martinez, Jackson said quietly as they reached the extraction point. I'm sorry about the noise earlier, but David Kim's surveillance teams weren't interested in peaceful surrender. Elena stepped forward, her dark eyes assessing Rachel with the clinical attention of someone trained to recognize victims of trauma. How are you holding up? I know this must be overwhelming after what you've been through. Rachel straightened her shoulders, drawing on reserves of strength that had kept her alive through 3 years of systematic abuse. I'm ready to do whatever's necessary to stop these people from hurting others. Jackson nodded approvingly. That's what we needed to hear. The next phase of this operation is going to be challenging, and we need to know that you're committed to seeing it through to the end. What's the next phase? Marcus asked, noting that Jackson's tone suggested complications they hadn't previously discussed. Elena exchanged a glance with her partner before answering. Maria Santos discovered something troubling while preparing for Rachel's testimony. David Kim's organization has been notified that she's alive and planning to cooperate with federal authorities. The news hit Marcus like a physical blow. How is that possible? We only contacted Maria this afternoon. Because David Kim has sources inside the federal prosecutor's office, Jackson replied grimly. Someone with access to Maria's communications has been feeding information to the criminal organization we're trying to prosecute. Rachel felt the familiar despair that had characterized her life for the past 3 years, the sense that David Kim's reach was so extensive that escape was ultimately impossible. So they know everything? They know about your extraction plan, about my location, about the testimony I'm planning to give? They know some things, but not others, Elena said carefully. Maria Santos has been running a compartmentalized investigation, sharing different information with different people to identify the source of leaks. The communications that were compromised didn't include details about our extraction methods or the secure location where you'll be giving testimony. Marcus understood the implications immediately. Maria was running a counterintelligence operation, using false information to flush out the traitor in her office. Exactly, and it worked. We now know that Deputy Federal Prosecutor William Chun has been providing information to David Kim's organization for at least 6 months. The revelation that a high-ranking federal prosecutor was working for the criminal organization explained how David Kim's people had been able to operate with apparent immunity from law enforcement interference. It also suggested that the corruption Rachel's testimony could expose extended much deeper into government institutions than anyone had initially suspected. What does this mean for Rachel's testimony? Marcus asked. Jackson's expression grew grim. It means that instead of testifying in a federal courthouse where security might be compromised, Rachel will be giving her statement to a specially convened grand jury at an undisclosed location. The proceedings will be conducted by prosecutors from outside Arizona, and the only people with access to the testimony will be those who've been cleared through extensive background investigations. Rachel looked between Jackson and Elena, recognizing the extraordinary measures being taken to protect her testimony, while also understanding that such precautions were necessary because the enemy they were fighting had penetrated the highest levels of law enforcement. How do we get to this undisclosed location? She asked. Elena gestured toward a narrow trail that led deeper into the desert, away from the ranch and toward terrain that would be difficult for vehicles to navigate. We're going to walk there. It's about 5 miles through some rough country. But it's the only way to avoid the surveillance network that David Kim's organization has established around all major transportation routes. Marcus looked at Rachel's bare feet, remembering that she'd walked 15 miles across the desert to reach his ranch just days earlier. Rachel, are you sure you can handle another desert hike? I can handle whatever I need to handle, Rachel replied with determination. I've been running from these people for 3 years. If walking 5 miles through the desert gets me the chance to finally fight back, then that's what I'll do. Jackson opened a military-style backpack and withdrew 2 pairs of hiking boots, along with basic survival supplies for the desert crossing. We came prepared for the possibility that a foot extraction would be necessary. These should fit well enough to get you through the terrain ahead. As Rachel put on the boots, Marcus realized that he was about to leave his family's ranch for what might be the last time. 4 generations of stone men had built their lives on this land, creating a legacy of honest work and community service that had defined his identity since childhood. I need a moment, Marcus said, looking back toward the house that contained everything he'd inherited from his ancestors. Elena nodded understandingly. Take your time. But remember that David Kim's organization will certainly have backup surveillance teams moving into position. We have maybe 30 minutes before this area becomes dangerous again. Marcus walked a few steps away from the group, looking across the desert landscape that had shaped his family's history for over a century. The moon was nearly full, casting silver light across the mesquite and sage brush that stretched endlessly toward mountains barely visible on the horizon. This was the land where his great-grandfather had learned that determination could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, where his grandfather had built a prosperous ranch through decades of careful stewardship, where his father had served the community while maintaining the family tradition of integrity and hard work. By choosing to help Rachel fight for justice, Marcus was continuing that tradition in a way his ancestors would have understood and approved. The methods were different, but the underlying commitment to protecting the innocent and standing up to those who abused power remained constant. I'm ready, Marcus said, returning to the group with renewed determination. The 5-mile hike through the Arizona desert tested everyone's endurance, though Jackson and Elena moved with the effortless efficiency of people who'd conducted similar operations in much more hostile environments. Rachel proved that her earlier desert crossing hadn't been a fluke. Despite her recent trauma, she possessed the mental toughness necessary to endure physical hardship without complaint. Marcus found himself struggling more than he'd expected, his 8 years of sedentary ranch life having left him less fit than he'd realized. But the physical challenge also served as a form of meditation, allowing him to process the magnitude of what they were attempting and the likelihood that their lives would never return to normal. Tell me about your testimony, Elena said to Rachel as they paused to rest at the halfway point of their journey. What specifically will you be able to tell the grand jury about David Kim's organization? Rachel took a sip from her water bottle before answering. I can testify about the systematic way they recruit women, the methods they use to break down resistance, and the financial structure they use to launder money through legitimate businesses. Do you have specific information about David Kim himself? I met him multiple times. He personally supervised some of the more Intensive training sessions designed to ensure compliance from women who were resisting their assignments. Marcus heard the carefully controlled emotion in Rachel's voice and understood that she was describing experiences too traumatic to discuss in detail. The fact that she was willing to relive those memories in federal testimony demonstrated a level of courage that humbled him. "What about the government officials who were protecting his operation?" Jackson asked. "I was present at meetings where David Kim discussed payments to law enforcement officers, judges, and prosecutors. I can identify specific individuals and describe the services they provided in exchange for those payments." Elena and Jackson exchanged glances that suggested Rachel's testimony would be even more valuable than they'd initially understood. The ability to identify specific corrupt officials would allow federal authorities to conduct a comprehensive investigation that could dismantle the entire network of corruption that protected David Kim's organization. "Rachel," Elena said gently, "you understand that testifying about these things will make you a target for the rest of your life. David Kim's organization doesn't forget, and they have resources that extend far beyond normal criminal enterprises." "I understand," Rachel replied, without hesitation. "But I also understand that if I don't testify, other women will continue to suffer what I suffered. That's not acceptable to me." As they resumed their desert crossing, Marcus found himself thinking about the courage it took to choose justice over personal safety. For 8 years, he'd chosen safety over engagement, isolation over the risks that came with standing up for what was right. Rachel's example was forcing him to confront the possibility that his withdrawal from the world had been motivated more by cowardice than by wisdom. The secure location where Rachel would give her testimony turned out to be an abandoned mining facility that had been converted into a temporary federal courthouse. The site was isolated, easily defended, and equipped with communication technology that would allow grand jury proceedings to be conducted with participants located in multiple states. As they approached the facility, Marcus could see armed guards positioned around the perimeter and federal vehicles that suggested a significant law enforcement presence. For the first time since this ordeal began, he felt like they might actually be safe from David Kim's reach. "This is where we part ways for now," Jackson said as they reached the facility's entrance. "Rachel will be in federal custody for the duration of her testimony, which could take several days. Marcus, you'll be debriefed about your observations of David Kim's surveillance operations, then relocated to a safe house until the grand jury completes its work." Rachel turned to Marcus, her eyes filled with gratitude and something that looked like affection. "Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. You gave me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" "Hope that good. People still exist in the world." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion as he realized that Rachel had given him exactly the same gift. "Take care of yourself in there. And remember that Carol Manning and Agent Walsh would be proud of what you're doing." As federal agents escorted Rachel into the facility, Marcus watched her walk toward a future that would either bring justice for countless victims or mark her for death by one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the country. But for the first time in 8 years, Marcus felt like he was on the right side of a fight that mattered. Whatever happened next, he'd chosen courage over cowardice, engagement over isolation. The bitter cowboy who'd lost faith in redemption had found it through helping a broken woman seek justice. Their love story was just beginning, but it was already proving that sometimes the most beautiful transformations come from the darkest circumstances when people choose to fight for each other rather than surrender to despair. The small white church in Cedar Falls, Colorado sat nestled between pine-covered mountains and meadows that bloomed with wildflowers during the brief summer months. It was exactly the kind of peaceful, anonymous place where two people could start over without the weight of their past defining every conversation and relationship. Marcus Stone stood at the altar wearing his grandfather's wedding suit, carefully preserved for over 60 years and altered to fit his broader frame. The man who'd lost faith in redemption was about to marry the woman who'd taught him that grace could emerge from the darkest circumstances when people chose courage over despair. Rachel Martinez walked down the aisle wearing a simple white dress. She'd chosen herself, the first major decision she'd made in years without considering how it might affect her safety or survival. Her hair had grown longer during the months of federal protection, and the haunted expression that had characterized her features when Marcus first found her praying in his chapel had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like peace. The congregation was small but significant. Maria Santa sat in the front row, having traveled from Phoenix, where she was now heading a federal task force dedicated to dismantling human trafficking networks. Jackson Rivers and Elena Vasquez occupied the second row, still working as private contractors but now focused on protecting witnesses rather than eliminating threats. Father Miguel Rodriguez, the elderly priest who'd agreed to perform the ceremony, had listened to their story with the understanding of someone who'd spent 40 years ministering to people whose faith had been tested by circumstances beyond their control. He'd agreed to marry them not despite their complicated past, but because of the redemption they'd found through helping each other heal. "Dearly beloved," Father Rodriguez began, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of two souls who have found in each other what they thought was lost forever, the ability to trust, to hope, and to believe that love can triumph over even the darkest experiences." Marcus looked into Rachel's eyes and saw reflected there the same wonder he felt about the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, he'd been a bitter recluse convinced that justice was a myth and human goodness an illusion. Today, he was marrying a woman whose courage had inspired him to reclaim his faith in the possibility that broken people could be made whole. The federal grand jury had been in session for 3 months, with Rachel's testimony serving as the foundation for indictments that were still being unsealed. David Kim himself had been arrested in a coordinated international operation that involved law enforcement agencies from 6 countries. The criminal organization that had seemed untouchable just months earlier was now systematically being dismantled by prosecutors who finally had the evidence they needed to overcome corruption and institutional protection. Deputy Federal Prosecutor William Chen had been arrested on charges of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and accepting bribes. His cooperation with federal investigators was providing additional evidence of corruption that extended throughout the Arizona legal system and into federal agencies that were supposed to protect society from exactly the kind of crimes they'd been enabling. But the legal victories, important as they were, paled in comparison to the personal transformation that Marcus and Rachel had experienced through their shared commitment to justice and their growing love for each other. "Marcus," Father Rodriguez continued, "do you take Rachel to be your wife, promising to love and protect her through whatever challenges you may face together?" "I do," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the strength of someone who'd learned that true courage comes from protecting others rather than isolating yourself from their problems. "Rachel, do you take Marcus to be your husband, promising to trust him with your heart and build a future together based on the love you've discovered through your shared trials?" "I do," Rachel answered, tears streaming down her face as she thought about the desperate woman who'd collapsed in an abandoned chapel 6 months earlier, begging God for a chance at redemption that had seemed impossible. The exchange of rings was simple but profound. Marcus slipped under Rachel's finger a band that had belonged to his grandmother, a woman who'd believed that marriage was a sacred commitment to help each other become the best versions of themselves. Rachel placed on Marcus's hand a ring she'd chosen herself, engraved with the words faith, hope, love, in memory of the qualities that had saved them both. "By the power vested in me by the state of Colorado and in the presence of this loving community, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Father Rodriguez announced. "Marcus, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was tender and full of promise, sealing a commitment that had been forged through shared danger, but would be sustained by shared love and mutual respect. As they embraced, the small congregation erupted in applause that echoed through the mountain church like a celebration of hope itself. The reception was held at a nearby inn that specialized in small, intimate gatherings. Marcus and Rachel had deliberately chosen simplicity over extravagance, wanting their wedding to reflect the authentic love they'd discovered, rather than the elaborate ceremonies that often masked empty relationships. During the dinner, Maria Santos stood to offer a toast that captured the significance of what they were celebrating. 6 months ago, I received a phone call from a former sheriff who'd lost faith in justice and a young woman who'd survived 3 years of systematic abuse. Today, we're celebrating not just their marriage, but the proof that broken people can heal each other when they choose courage over fear. Maria raised her glass toward the newlyweds. Marcus and Rachel, your love story began with a desperate prayer in an abandoned chapel and a stranger's willingness to help someone in need. It's a reminder that grace often comes disguised as ordinary human kindness, and that redemption is always possible for those brave enough to fight for it. Jackson Rivers added his own perspective during an impromptu speech that revealed the depth of respect these hardened professionals had developed for Marcus and Rachel's courage. In our line of work, we see a lot of people who've been broken by evil. Most of them never fully recover. But Rachel and Marcus didn't just recover. They transformed their pain into purpose and their trauma into triumph. As the evening progressed, Marcus found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment of unexpected happiness. The ranch in Arizona had been sold to a conservation trust that would preserve it as open space while providing funds for the Victims Assistance Foundation that he and Rachel were establishing. The foundation would focus specifically on helping women escape trafficking situations and rebuild their lives with dignity and purpose. Rachel would direct the day-to-day operations, drawing on her personal experience to design programs that address the complex needs of trauma survivors. Marcus would handle security and law enforcement coordination, using his background to ensure that the women they helped remained safe from the criminal organizations they'd escaped. "What are you thinking about?" Rachel asked, joining Marcus on the inn's terrace where he'd stepped outside to get some air and process the emotions of their wedding day. "I'm thinking about that night when I found you in the chapel," Marcus replied, pulling her close as they looked out at the Colorado mountains. "You were asking God for a chance at redemption, and I was convinced that redemption was impossible. What do you think now?" Marcus considered the question carefully, understanding that his answer would reflect not just his current mood, but his fundamental beliefs about human nature and divine grace. "I think redemption isn't something God gives us, it's something we give each other when we choose love over fear, service selfishness." Rachel smiled, remembering the desperate prayer she'd whispered in the abandoned chapel just 6 months earlier. "I asked God to show me how to be someone different, someone worthy of the life I'd been given. I never imagined the answer would be a bitter cowboy who'd lost faith in everything I was praying for." "Maybe that's how grace works," Marcus suggested. "Maybe God uses broken people to heal each other because we understand suffering in ways that undamaged people never could." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set behind mountain peaks that promised tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to make a difference in the world. Their honeymoon would be brief, just a week in the Colorado mountains before they returned to Arizona to begin the difficult work of establishing their foundation and helping other trafficking victims find their own paths to freedom and healing. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Rachel asked, understanding that their real work was just beginning. "I'm ready to spend my life proving that the woman who prayed for redemption in my family's chapel deserves every happiness this world can offer," Marcus replied. "And I'm ready to help other women discover that they deserve the same thing." As they prepared to return to the reception, Marcus thought about Carol Manning and Agent Jennifer, Walsh, two women who died fighting the same evil that had nearly destroyed Rachel. Their sacrifice had not been in vain. The criminal organization that had killed them was now being systematically dismantled, and their memory would live on through the foundation that would help countless other women escape similar fates. "Do you think Carol and Jennifer know?" Rachel asked, somehow reading Marcus's thoughts. "I think they know that their fight wasn't finished when they died," Marcus replied. "I think they know that we're continuing their work and that every woman we help represents a victory over the evil that tried to silence them." Later that night, as Marcus and Rachel settled into their honeymoon suite, they talked about the future they would build together. Children who would grow up understanding that their parents had chosen each other after surviving the worst that humanity could offer. A foundation that would provide hope to women who believed hope was impossible. A love story that would inspire others to believe that redemption was always possible when people chose courage over despair. "I love you," Rachel whispered as they drifted off to sleep in each other's arms. "I love you too," Marcus replied, marveling at how those simple words had the power to heal wounds that had seemed permanent. Just months earlier, outside their window, the Colorado mountains stood silent under a canopy of stars that had witnessed countless human struggles between good and evil, hope and despair, love and fear. But inside the small inn-room, two people who'd been broken by their encounters with evil were sleeping peacefully in the knowledge that they'd chosen each other, chosen justice, and chosen love. The bitter cowboy who hadn't believed in redemption had found it through helping a former prostitute discover that she was worthy of grace. Their story proved that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the most desperate circumstances, and that healing is always possible when broken people choose to save each other. Their wedding day marked not an ending, but a beginning, the start of a life dedicated to proving that love could indeed conquer all when combined with the courage to fight for justice and the faith to believe that redemption was possible even for those who thought they were beyond saving. In the abandoned chapel where their story began, a wooden cross still stood sentinel over empty pews, waiting for the next desperate soul who might seek sanctuary and find instead the beginning of their own journey toward grace. Marcus and Rachel Stone would return there someday, bringing their children to the place where a broken cowboy had found a praying woman and discovered that sometimes angels come disguised as the very people we think we're trying to save. Their love story would inspire others for generations to come, proving that redemption is always possible when people choose courage over fear, love over bitterness, and hope over despair. The bitter cowboy and the former prostitute had become something neither could have achieved alone, living proof that grace exists in the willingness of broken people to heal each other through love. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.
Okay. Hi, baby. How y'all doing? Hi, Jordy. Hi, buddy. What's going on? Yeah? What you doing? Let me double check. Mm, okay, yeah, I think we are gonna raid 9 tonight.